Good morning, panel.
Good morning.
So David, I'm going to start with you. You've built some very impressive large-scale buildings, some of them in LA. Can you tell us about why you chose green and how challenging it's been for you to be a developer in the green area?
We were talking just before the panel about how green has changed in the last 2 decades. So you have to go back in time. And we were joking that if you went back to a green conference 20 years ago when we started, there would have been Ed, there would have been me, and I don't think there would have been too many other people. Ed said we would have dressed better. So green buildings changed tremendously, but to go back into time, I really went into the real estate business at a time when green was just becoming at the cusp of commercial, potentially viable. But it really had yet to come down the cost curve to the point that it could compete in its own right with so-called non-green development. So in those days, the push was to see if we could take green into the mainstream. And to do that, I felt that there's lots of different applications and lots of different buildings, but in the commercial sense, we felt we needed to do a building that can compete on its own right, stand in its own self, so we wanted to bring green into the luxury market because our costs were much, much higher in those days, and we really needed a market that was ready to embrace both philosophically living green and also interest in the idea of what a green building would represent. And we were very lucky because in Los Angeles, we had this intersection of, frankly, this community that understood the importance of what green, the potential of what green could represent. So we were an early pioneer and we gave it a go. But from the earliest days, I had a wacky uncle who came back from Israel in 1972 with a solar contraption that really wasn't very much, but he was intent on heating, I guess, his pool with it. And I swam in that very cold pool most of my childhood. And I always thought, why doesn't solar work better? Why doesn't this become the way it's done? It was the way it was really done in Europe. So why isn't it done here in the US? Why don't we look at end-to-end full costs? So that's what set out to do it, and I think we set out to first build great projects, and in our mind, green was simply the state of the state of what a great building could be.
And are you finding that is most of your work, or at least it began on the coasts in New York, LA, San Francisco? I mean, I would think that's the easiest way to begin. And from there, I'm curious, and any of you can respond to this, but how hard has it been to introduce this technology to the flyover states?
That's not really an area that we've been active in because the sort of application that we approached was in the luxury green market. We were very fortunate early on to attract great architecture to these projects. Richard Meyer, who had just done the Getty Center in Los Angeles, did our very first project. So we were really focused on the luxury market where there'd be no subsidies, where these projects could stand on their own and succeed, so we could build another one.
Yeah.
that was our ambition in those days.
So maybe I could speak to sort of the flyover states. So maybe we could kind of define what a green building is, because maybe different people have different definitions. One definition would be a building that uses more energy efficient components and has a more efficient design and maybe is used more efficiently than a comparable building. And what we're finding in the Midwest and in the South and other places where we're doing projects is that green buildings have lower operating costs. And so the owners are motivated to invest in green buildings because they'll have higher operating income from it. So green buildings, are more profitable than non-green buildings, and that's the message that's really resonating for folks outside of the coast.
But it's more expensive initially, but pays off in the long run. Is that still true?
Yes, so more efficient equipment does have a higher upfront cost, and there's a number of ways of financing these that sort of take away that upfront pain that might occur. We'll talk about that later.
Jennifer, you were talking about some of the things that you're doing at the foundation, and the research that's been done on the health of families by putting them in green buildings. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, would love to. So kind of carrying the conversation from the coast into the middle of the country, and then if you think through the income spectrum, so high luxury, more mixed use, which combines affordable plus low income type of living opportunities. And then you get into some of the older stock in our country where there is a lower income population living. And this is stock that is worn down, has been around for a few hundred years. And what I was sharing before is we walked into this retrofit work actually through lead paint in a lot of places. And it was the lead paint that we were looking to remove from these single-family homes. As we've all learned, this is really a toxin that can really affect the children that live in these households. And it was through that process that some of the early operators, the NGOs that were going in and doing this work, they would be removing the lead paint and looking up at the ceiling and seeing a hole in the roof and seeing the water coming into the home. And mold, as we discussed, became an issue, asbestos became an issue, and it really became a health concern. How do we really retrofit these homes so they're good living spaces? While that was happening, the next wave quickly took on. If we are in this process of retrofitting, back to your comment, how can we create lower operating costs or family income or expenses by really making them green? And those two practices started to come together to create better outcomes holistically for the kids, the families living there. And one of the direct outcomes we see now, which is very intuitive as you think about it, but we didn't see coming when we started making these first investments, one in Baltimore in particular that we made in older housing stock, is that the kids actually went to the emergency room less often, because what they were suffering from was severe asthma and inability to really live well in these homes. As soon as these homes became better places to live, the emergency room visits dropped. And guess what? Now we had Johns Hopkins at the table thinking about how do we create financing with you that can really actually upgrade a whole bunch of stock that's in our catchment area, because it's reducing our cost of doing business. Yeah. And that's where we're at today.
So that's like a win-win thing.
Big time.
And on the subject of retrofitting, Ed, you just recently built this beautiful, gorgeous LEED Platinum home. And I know that you initially were thinking about retrofitting your old house, or I guess the house or the land that you built this house on. What goes into deciding whether you retrofit or you start from scratch when you want a really green house? I mean, I know that money is a consideration, but at what point does it not make sense to retrofit a house and it just makes sense to level it and start from scratch?
That's what I concentrated on for decades was retrofits. From 1970, when I started trying to make my apartment, then my first home, more energy efficient, I focused on that. That's what a lot of people are going to do. And there's a lot of embedded energy and carbon in an existing structure, commercial, residential. So you want to keep that going as long as you can. But then there comes a point, and we hit that point where we couldn't build any more in the small lot that we had, so we sought another lot elsewhere, because we had a teenager and we were sharing a bathroom, 3 of us together in one bathroom. It was a recipe for disaster. Yeah. Rochelle finally won that battle. She wanted more closet space in another bathroom. That's how it started.
And she got it.
She got what she wanted. So we hired a wonderful architect, William Hefner, and what he wanted and what Rochelle wanted was to hide all the stuff so you wouldn't see a lot of it. A lot of it's in the walls and hidden anyway in any home, but to hide the solar. I kind of like looking at solar, but a lot of people don't. You can't see any of it. You can go to my backyard, even get up on a ladder and go, Begley's a liar. There's not 1 kilowatt of solar on his roof. You got to get a pretty high ladder to get up above. There's only a little parapet this big at the south end of the property, but then the panels are sloped such that it's just invisible from anywhere on the property. We had a little drone with a camera on it to take a picture of it finally so people could see there's panels up there and 9 kilowatts of them. But in a larger sense, I want to talk about the wisdom of when you hit that point from mold or whatever reason, outgrowing a home, you have to build new construction. When people looked at the cost of a home, they, for years, for decades, would look, for longer than that, for centuries, they'd look at the cost, the labor and materials. What does it cost? How much wood, how much steel, how much labor? You figure in your financing costs, your property taxes, all of that they wisely included. But they didn't really look at it the right way. That's the way people looked at icebergs before the Titanic. Look at that iceberg out there. It looks to be the size of a refrigerator. There's a lot more below the waterline, and you can crash and you can take on a lot of water. And so that's what the cost of a building really is, that whole iceberg. The amount below the waterline is the cost of running that home. And I'm going to make a prediction now. I've done it now since 1970. I'm going to make this prediction. I have some psychic abilities. Hold on. Energy prices will go up. And they've been going up for a while. There's dips. The price of cheap, fracked natural gas has, changed the market for a while, and that will continue a bit, but eventually that will change. And when you look at all the costs of a home, you must include the energy costs, and that's the right way to look at it. If you build right and build smart, and we did, a lot of the stuff we did in this fancy pants home, you can do in a much smaller home. We built, we have like a yacht. This home is like compared to a yacht. You can have a cabin cruiser, you can have a dinghy, and do a lot of the same things. You can do LED lighting, you can do Lutron smart, switches and controls. You can do good, insulation. There's so much that you can do on a very modest budget. And I encourage people to do that if it's new construction or a remodel. But we did new construction, and man, with the 2017 technology, and some of it 2016 and 15 technology, when we were partway through the project, it's just amazing what you can do. The energy costs on this larger house is much less than the smaller house. So that's what you can do today, and I know Josh and David and Jennifer all know that very well, and they've addressed it in their lives as well.
And there's something I have to say about your house that really blew me away, and that's the lighting. I am so sensitive to lighting, and I hate fluorescents. And when they first came out and we were all told that we had to have them, it just made me so sad because you never look pretty and you never feel particularly romantic. And so our house was like the darkest house ever. But your house with LED lighting and the light fixtures you have and the shades, there's this beautiful amber light that those of us who care about that sort of thing really can embrace. So you can be doing the right thing and not having to sacrifice the ambiance, which is one of the great sort of
Thank you there. Eaton
innovations.
lighting instruments, wonderful lighting, recessed lighting, and other lighting instruments from Eaton, controlled by Lutron Smart Controls. My wife, Rochelle, hated CFLs. She put them behind shades for years. I had those back in the late 80s, early 90s. She hated the newer bulbs that came along fairly recently, the LEDs, because they were very cool. Now the color temperature is much lower, beautiful, fully dimmable, and that's what you have today. You don't have to compromise anything to have LEDs. And the cost of them now, when you figure how long these bulbs last, and they're really learning this a lot in commercial. There's many other cost savings in commercial. You got to hire a person with a scissor lift to get up and change these things in a factory, some commercial structures. There's cost to changing light bulbs or what have you. You can have some of these lighting instruments, LEDs, in there for decades and decades. So there's many costs involved with doing the right kind of lighting, and your costs are going to be greatly reduced. That's just one facet.
Can you guys talk to all of us about small steps people can take in their everyday lives, about ways that they can reduce their carbon footprint, particularly in terms of their living situations? I know, David, that you tend to deal with larger buildings, but Joshua, I know your group has been doing some really innovative work in getting some of these low-income houses made without any help from the government, which is very interesting. You're kind of doing it. Is that correct? Am I getting that right?
Sort of, yeah. There's a couple questions. One is around how do any of us make the houses that we live in or the buildings that we play in and work in more efficient and more sustainable. And I think we can't manage something that we don't measure first, right? So I think it begins with perhaps engaging a sustainability consultant or someone to come into our houses and see, okay, well, where's air leaking, or where is there an opportunity to put in LEDs and really kind of get a holistic picture of where are we at right now, and starting from there. My company, Clean Fund, what we do is we provide capital to commercial building owners to do energy efficiency, water efficiency, renewable energy projects, and then we get repaid via our clients' property taxes using a structure called PACE. And you might ask, well, how would that work? Well, for 100 years in California, we've been paying property assessments for things in the public interest, like paving the sidewalk in the local public school, et cetera. And the city of Berkeley decided in 2008 it wanted citizens to have more solar, and people didn't want to pay the $50,000 up front it costs to put solar. So they created this mechanism called PACE that 33 states have adopted. And it's an example of a public partnership that doesn't involve any government money whatsoever. And I think we need more solutions like this if we're going to get to the trillions of dollars that we need to tackle climate change, right? There's no leadership coming out of the federal government, and we have to accept that right now. And in the absence of that, there's so much we can be doing already. And I think that all the panelists and then the work you're doing speaks to that.
I would just add to that, on the spectrum, the work kind of very complementary to everyone on this panel, but especially what you just spoke about, is the work we do at Calvert Foundation. And why we do what we do is, at the end, about a quarter of the money, and we're not a foundation investing grants, but we're actually an entity, a financial intermediary investing debt. And a quarter of the money we're investing is going into affordable housing opportunities around the globe. Many, almost all of them, have a greening element to it. So whether it's renewables or whether it's retrofitting, it's about a quarter of the work we do. But why we do what we do is we're really out there to enable and educate people about how to be financial activists. One of the biggest assets we have as individuals is our investment portfolio, our wealth. And even myself, when I sit down and I think about where that money is, it is not aligned with what I'm doing, like the solar panels on my own house at home. And when we start to ask that tough question, it's a difficult then next step of, well, what do I do? And that's where organizations like Calvert Foundation and Calvert Investments Funds, Calvert Research Management comes in. Many of you heard John Stroyer yesterday speak. We are groups that are helping us all become responsible investors. And there's a spectrum to that. There's investments you can make in the public markets, equity and debt, if you think that's one end of the spectrum. On the other is your philanthropy and how that aligns with what you care about. And in the middle, there's private investments you can make, investments in funds or directly in social businesses. And that's where we sit, Calvert Foundation. We're in that middle bucket, and we're helping, because you can buy our note for as low as $20, really engage everyday investors in aligning their money with what they care about. So if we need billions and billions of dollars to really change the climate change trajectory we're on, and a lot of that can be in retrofitting homes, what we're doing at Calvert Foundation is aggregating capital from people in this room and directing it into low-income, underserved markets where there potentially is not commercial capital, traditional capital, or personal wealth available to do the work that we know that needs to get done. So another way we can all just take one step is indirect, but very directly think about where our money is invested and maybe change some of those dollars.
That's really interesting you brought that up, because it's the whole idea of voting with your pocketbook.
Yes.
That in every purchase we make, if we're more conscious about where that product is coming from, if you can trace it back, you realize whether you're supporting something you believe in or not. And if the dollars aren't there, the product goes away. We recently left Wells Fargo. Our investments were there, and last year it became clear that something wasn't quite right in the state of Denmark, and I actually did speak to John about that. And finding a group that really is in alignment with, if you're going to put any of your money at risk or invest in something, shouldn't it be something that you really are rooting for and you have a real passionate investment in your soul? In terms of investments, are you finding, it seems that the train has left the station in terms of this culture, hopefully, is going to become greener and greener as time goes by, and I think it's already been proven that that's the right track to be on. But in terms of investors, Can any of you speak to whether or not young investors, young entrepreneurs are the ones who are really getting behind the green sort of companies, or if it's something that the older, more conservative investors are also backing because they know it's probably bottom line, even if they didn't believe in it themselves to begin with, they realize it's good business.
So one thing that I can speak to, and perhaps David, I'd love your perspective on this too, is we have a lot of clients who are not motivated by sustainability when they create green buildings. They're motivated by getting the best rents that they can. And millennials want to be in green buildings. I mean, it's the reality. And study after study is showing that green buildings command higher rents, higher occupancy, and higher sales prices than non-green buildings. So I think a lot of that is driven by the tenant base and the tenants being millennials wanting to be in these type of buildings. I'm curious what others think.
I think there is a real demand now for green. I'm not embarrassed to admit in this crowd that has helped launch the Prius that when I went looking for a solution, how do we put up these buildings? How do we make them happen despite the fact that there were no lenders, there were no equity investors, there was quite literally zero capital available to do that? A better answer probably would have been not to launch the largest green building in the world in those days. But we felt if green was going to go anywhere, it should be adapted, it should be the way it is, and we should prove there's a market. So I found a car dealer who was a Lexus dealer in Beverly Hills, and he was kind enough to listen to 100 of my questions. And I had to go to a car dealer because there was no real estate guys to talk to. Everybody I went to, I said, how do you build one of these things? Nobody knew. How do you finance one? Nobody knew. Will there be anybody who will live in these when they're done? Well, a lot of people encouraged me. They said, I'd really like to do the right thing. I'd like to live in a building like that. But we had this 1970s granola image. So they said, I'd like to do the right thing, but I really like to shower, so I don't want to go into that building. Well, the Lexus dealer showed me, I don't remember what the model of the car was, but this car, and now these are the early days, we had a hybrid. And he said, and this hybrid of that model costs $12,000 more. Now, gas prices will do this and they'll do that, but there's no economic payback. You have to live a whole lifetime for gas prices in order to justify that price increase. And when we began to brainstorm about that, a lot of the folks who were in those days trying to figure out how to make market in green products, we began to realize something else was going on. There was real demand. Somebody bought that hybrid, not because of just economics. They bought that hybrid because it was green. And that was an aha moment for me. That was the thing that actually gave me the hope that if you build it, they will come. But it really was a leap of faith. I would like to say that today, in the middle of the downturn, when most traditional real estate folks are on the sidelines, we weren't. We built 12 buildings, and we didn't build any of them because they were spec. It was all because tenants wanted to be in those green buildings. So we are now seeing tenants who feel, who drive the entire commercial marketplace. This isn't something that a developer decides to do. It goes to where the demand is. So we're seeing tenants that say, for our culture, this is important for our company. We want to be in a place that has best practices. You mentioned a number of the features. They apply not just to single-family homes, but they apply to commercial projects. In the early days, I'm not a scientist, but I read all of the data, and it was believed that about 48% of emissions could be solved by retrofitting these old buildings. So later, there'll be a big genius who will solve this all. But I figured in the real estate business, we could do our part, and we didn't have to wait. We could get after that right now. So companies like what Josh's are doing, they're financing the retrofit component of these buildings. I think we were on a mission. So we went after sort of two types at the same time. We went after large-scale developments, but we also went after Transamerica. Because Transamerica, as far as I was concerned, was this great iconic building that nobody could fill. And it was just an outdated dinosaur, and if somebody could retrofit it and figure out how to have a new life with that building, we could really make a difference. So I think that in the end, we do have a real green market today. It's not something we're just hoping people do the right thing. It is based on best business practices. So in my opinion, when you get to that stage, the revolution has won, and it simply becomes the way it's done.
In spite of the political climate or the leadership in Washington, it seems that this is something that already it's taken on a life of its own. And I remember when we started, God, years ago when I first came to the EMA board, 19 years ago, and I had been living for 5 years in a tiny little cabin off the grid with real basic solar, and we had our own well, and no utility bills, but no light part of the time. And it was pretty basic, but we now live in a pretty green home, which we built, and I learned so much from that experience, and we took the best of it, and then built on that, because you can do that as the technology gets better and better, and so now you don't have to really give up on any kind of comfort to choose green. There's a phrase, greenwashing, which reminds me of when we've been through all of this with cage-free eggs, for example. You know, you go into a store and you're trying to buy organic things or know where your food is coming from, and it's often very misleading, and the labeling can be very confusing and not very accurate. When people are looking at supposed green products, or how would you describe greenwashing, and how prevalent has that been in what you do? How difficult is it for you to, as people who are investing in building, how strict are the rules of bringing a building to a sort of LEED standard?
Well, I'll just
Ed,
start off.
yeah.
You know, the U.S. Green Building Council and their LEED standards are pretty stringent, and they look at everything, which is a good thing. Some people have groused about them, about including some of these sideline issues, they refer to them, but I think there are no sideline issues. They are all important. You don't just look at the eventual electric bill of the house, the natural gas bill, or the water bill. They look at the amount of waste that you make during the construction process. They look at where the materials come from. If you're going to get some Italian marble, you're going to lose points on that. You gain more by getting them from a local quarry, you know, to get some local stone product and what have you, some sustainable stone product. Or get your tile from, let's say, Oceanside Glass and Tile, where they have a high post-consumer recycled content of all their tiles, or bathroom tiles, or what have you. Or Caesar stone, which is just quartz. It's not coming from some, you know, foreign country. They look at all of that, and I think that's important. I like those LEED rules. At first, some of it seemed confusing to me, but now I really like every one of them. They've spent a lot of time thinking about them all, and you can get into silver, you can get in gold, you can get into platinum. Well, we wound up doing platinum, but I want to speak about the technology involved getting there, and it's something you're going to do if you're building from the ground up, and something you're definitely going to want to do if you want to do a retrofit. I want to speak in behalf of a home or business energy audit. Everybody out there that hasn't done it, go out now. Some of them are free from different utilities. Others you have to pay for, but worth every penny. You get yourself a home energy audit, and they come with today's technology, and they look at everything. You can't tell the temperature or the health of the patient, you know, without a thermometer and a BP cuff, and in this case, an MRI. You know, it's basically an X-ray machine, which is what you're using in a version of same. You're looking at the inside of the house with today's home energy audit tools. They have something called a blower door they put in the front door, and it seals up the front door, and they seal all the windows. They close all the windows and see how the seal holds up. They check the pressure on it. They have something called a thermal imaging device. That's like the MRI. They're looking in the walls to see where the heat and cooling is being lost. They have something called a duct blaster, where they put it on your air ducts to see if you're losing any air, you know, heating and cooling from your ducts. Today's technology, very efficient. Then you get a list, and you don't have to do anything on the list the first day or the first year. You do it at your own leisure, and you'd be wise to pick the low-hanging fruit first and do better insulation. I solved a problem in my house, a house you've been to many times, a house on Mound View. They lived at for 26 years. I had a lot of solar on the roof, and I had good insulation in the walls, or so I thought, but it wasn't full insulation. There were gaps in it. They discovered a hole in my house from inside to outside that was fixed by a $10 piece of insulation. And I'd had that hole, if you will, in the insulation for 20 years. So everything was working harder than it should have. I had very low utility bills, but they could have been lower, is my point. So get out there and get a home energy audit. And if you're going to get LEED certification, you're going to have to do that at some point. They'll come with those same tools and see how well you sealed up your building. New construction, old construction, get yourself a home or commercial energy audit. You're going to be very grateful you did.
Don't you wish you lived with Ed? Actually, when I met Ed, he taught me everything I know about garbage. And that's a whole other story. But do any of you guys have any questions for our panel? Any of you? Want to know anything? All right. Well, yes. So she's asking about prefab homes, modular homes. You see a lot of those. And where does that fall in terms of green? Do you know what the ratio is of, you're talking about newer ones that have just been built recently? Does anybody know?
The only thing I know is about a company called Project Frog that creates, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think net zero prefab houses, or very, very energy efficient prefab houses. They're worth looking up, but I don't know a ton else.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Blue homes. Oh, she's talking about, and that was is it Project Fog? Frog. Oh, Frog, like ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. Yeah. So she's talking about how Project Frog retrofitted this school and turned it green. Pretty great, yeah. Anyone else? Do you guys have anything you'd like to add? Well, thank you very much for joining us.